Walter Reed never ignored a call from his son, not even after 3 years of silence. So when Michael's name flashed across the cracked screen of his old flip phone that Sunday afternoon, Walter froze mid-swipe, grease still on his fingers from the carburetor he'd been fixing. "Dad," Michael said, voice low, careful. "Vanessa and I were talking. We thought maybe it's time to make things right. Come for dinner tonight, please." For a moment, Walter couldn't breathe. 3 years ago, their last conversation had ended with slammed doors and words that still echoed in his head. "You'll die with your money, old man." But something inside him, maybe the part Martha used to call his stubborn hope, answered, "All right, son, I'll be there." By 7, Walter's cab rolled through the manicured streets of Lake Oswego. The Reed mansion glowed like something from a magazine stone, columns, perfect hedges, and a chandelier visible through the tall windows. A housekeeper opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Reed," she said softly. "Welcome." Dinner began with polite laughter, stories rehearsed too well. Michael's suit looked sharp. Vanessa's smile sharper. Walter tried to convince himself that maybe this time family meant what it used to. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. One new message. "Get up. Leave now. Don't tell your son." His breath hitched. He looked across the table, Michael refilling his wine, Vanessa cutting the roast. Nothing seemed wrong yet. Everything was. Walter set down his fork, forcing a chuckle. "Excuse me," he murmured, clutching his stomach. "Too much roast." He stood, walked out, and didn't look back. Half an hour later, as police lights flashed across the Reed estate, Walter sat in the back of a patrol car, shaking not from fear, but from the realization that someone had just saved his life. What would you do if your own son tried to erase you for your inheritance? The house was too quiet without Martha. Every morning, Walter Reed filled the same dented kettle, brewed the same dark coffee, and sat by the kitchen window that looked out onto his overgrown backyard in Portland. A single cup. A single plate. A silence that didn't end. The garage had once kept him busy, 7 shops spread across the city, his name painted in red on each steel shutter, but retirement felt more like exile than peace. Now his days passed in loops of maintenance, oiling the front door hinges, feeding the neighbor's stray cat, rereading Martha's old recipe cards even though he never cooked. Her voice still lingered in the rooms. "Don't work too long, Walt. Come home before dinner." He'd smile just for a second before remembering that no one was calling him home anymore. On the fridge hung the only photo that still mattered, Michael's high school graduation, Martha beaming beside their son Walter, half out of frame, holding the camera. The picture was sun-faded and curled at the corners, but he refused to replace it. It reminded him of a time before ambition swallowed love. That afternoon when the call came, he almost didn't answer. The number on the screen was familiar, but strange, Michael's name, glowing like a ghost. For a full 10 seconds, Walter stared at it before flipping the phone open. "Dad," Michael's voice said, older now but still carrying that soft guilt of a boy who'd broken something valuable. "It's been too long." Walter swallowed hard. "Yes, it has. Vanessa and we were talking. Maybe it's time we stop fighting. We'd love for you to come to dinner tonight. She's making your favorite roast beef garlic potatoes. You'll come, won't you?" For a moment the kitchen light flickered. Walter looked at Martha's photo, half expecting her to speak. "You always wanted peace," she would have said. "Maybe it's time to stop waiting for the perfect apology." "All right," Walter said softly. "I'll come." After hanging up, he sat at the table for a long time. His reflection in the coffee cup looked older than he remembered. He thought about their last argument, Michael demanding $50,000 for a business opportunity, Walter refusing, the shouting, the slamming door. He'd told himself that night he'd never open that door again. And yet here he was, reaching for the suit Martha had bought him for Michael's college graduation. It still hung in the closet, wrapped in thin plastic. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar and years. Walter smoothed the lapels like she used to, whispering, "You were right, Martha. Families always find their way back." He wound her old pocket watch, tiny gears clicking to life, and slipped it into his vest. Time, she'd told him, was the one thing you couldn't buy back. He wanted to believe he still had enough left for one more reconciliation. Before leaving, he picked up a bottle of 20-year-old scotch from the cabinet. It had gathered dust since Martha's funeral. He polished the glass with his sleeve and tucked it under his arm. A peace offering, he thought. For my son. for whatever's left of us. The cab ride to Lake Oswego took 40 minutes. Outside the window, Portland's gray streets gave way to the trimmed perfection of the suburbs. Streetlights glowed gold on clean asphalt. Expensive cars lined quiet driveways. Walter shifted uncomfortably, noticing the oil stains on his shoes, the old calluses on his hands. When the cab pulled up to the mansion, he hesitated before getting out. The house was enormous, 3 stories of stone and glass light spilling from every window. It didn't look lived in. It looked staged. The front door opened before he could knock. A woman in a black dress stood there, mid-40s, tired eyes. "Mr. Reed," she asked softly. "Yes," he said, clearing his throat. "I'm Maria. Please come in." Her smile flickered, polite but uneasy, as though she wanted to say something but didn't dare. The air inside smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood. Michael appeared at the top of the stairs, all charm and confidence. "Dad," he said, rushing down to hug him. The gesture was warm, maybe too warm. "You look great. Still keeping that suit in shape?" Walter chuckled awkwardly. "It fits well enough." Vanessa appeared next, elegant in a silk dress, her hair pinned perfectly. "Mr. Reed," she said, kissing his cheek. "It's wonderful to finally have you here again." He smiled, though the perfection of it all made his stomach tighten. "You have a beautiful home," he said. "Thank you," Vanessa replied smoothly. "Michael's done well in real estate." "Real estate?" Walter nodded but didn't ask questions. He handed Michael the bottle of scotch. "For the table." Michael grinned. "Dad, this must have cost you—" "Don't worry about it," Walter interrupted. "It's meant to be shared." They led him into the dining room, a space that looked more like a magazine spread than a place to eat. A long mahogany table gleamed under a chandelier, every plate and fork perfectly aligned. Walter felt like an intruder in someone else's play. Dinner began with forced laughter, surface stories about weather travel business. Vanessa complimented his tie. Michael reminisced about the old garage days, the smell of oil and metal, how he missed the simpler times. But his tone didn't match his words. It was too polished, too rehearsed. Walter smiled when appropriate, nodded when required, but something about the rhythm of the evening felt wrong. He noticed how Maria hovered silently in the background, refilling glasses without meeting his eyes. When their gazes finally met for a brief second, she gave the smallest shake of her head, barely perceptible. That was when Walter felt the vibration in his pocket, his phone. He glanced down discreetly. One message, no name attached. "Get up, leave now, don't tell your son." For a moment the letters blurred. His chest tightened. He looked up. Michael was refilling his glass with wine, Vanessa cutting into her roast, smiling like a hostess on television. Nothing about the scene matched the dread that crawled through him. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Heart pounding so loud he thought they might hear it. His hands trembled slightly, so he clasped them under the table. "Everything okay, Dad?" Michael asked lightly. Walter forced a smile. "Just fine, son. Maybe eating too fast." Vanessa chuckled softly. "You always had a sensitive stomach." She teased, her tone gentle but her eyes sharp. Walter dabbed his mouth with the napkin, stood slowly. "Excuse me," he said, pressing a hand to his side. "Too much roast." "Of course," Michael said, his expression unreadable. As Walter stepped into the hallway, the chatter faded behind him. The marble floor gleamed under soft golden light. His reflection followed him across the tiles, an old man in a suit holding his composure like armor. He reached for the wall, steadying himself. The pocket watch ticked faintly in his vest, a reminder that every second mattered. In the quiet corridor, he whispered to no one, "Martha, what have I walked into?" The chandelier flickered once, as if answering him. Outside, through the tall windows, the night looked too still, too staged, like everything else in that house. He took a breath, slow and deliberate, and headed for the door. "If you got that message, would you stay or walk away?" The hallway stretched before Walter like a tunnel through time. The chandelier's flickering light shimmered against the marble, and with every breath memories came rushing back, the kind he had spent years trying to bury under grease and work. He could still see Michael as a boy, crouched beside him in the old garage, sleeves rolled up, eyes wide with curiosity. "What's this part, Dad?" he'd ask, pointing at the crankshaft. Walter would grin, wiping oil onto his rag. "That's the heart of it, son. Everything runs because this piece keeps turning." Those were the days when Michael's laughter filled the shop louder than any radio. The boy smelled of gasoline and hope. He'd hand over the wrong wrench half the time, but Walter didn't care. He'd been proud of his son's eagerness, proud that he wasn't afraid of getting dirty. Then came Martha's illness. The hospital nights, the silence afterward. When she was gone, the house turned hollow and the garage lost its rhythm. Michael had been 20 then, just old enough to start dreaming big and reckless. He stopped coming to the shop. His hands stayed clean, his shirts pressed. He started talking about investment portfolios, apps, and modern opportunities. Dad Michael had said one night at dinner you could expand if you just borrowed against the property. We could build something bigger. Walter shook his head. I built what I could with what I had. Debt isn't building, it's gambling. Michael rolled his eyes. You're stuck in the past, and you're chasing smoke, Walter had said. The words hit like hammers. When the arguments escalated, Martha had tried to stand between them, gentle but firm. He's just ambitious, Walt. Don't crush that. But ambition had already begun to twist into something sharper. After she passed, the distance turned to silence. Phone calls went unanswered. Holidays came and went. Then, one summer evening, Michael showed up at the garage with a folder under his arm and that same bright, confident grin. I've got a real shot this time, he'd said. A startup software for logistics tracking. Investors are interested, but I need seed money. $50,000 should cover the launch. Walter had stared at him for a long moment. $50,000 isn't a small ask. It's an investment in me, Michael replied. Walter's voice stayed calm, but his chest felt tight. I built these shops one wrench at a time. You think I just hand out that kind of money because you call it a dream? Michael's face hardened. I knew you wouldn't believe in me. It's not about belief, Walter said. It's about earning your way. The argument that followed tore what little remained between them. Michael shouted, knocking over a stack of invoices. You'll die with your money, old man. The door slammed. Tires screeched into the night. Walter hadn't seen him since. He'd replayed that night more times than he could count, sometimes defending himself, sometimes blaming himself. Maybe he'd been too harsh. Maybe Martha would have known how to reach him. He'd even written a letter once, a clumsy attempt at reconciliation, but never mailed it. It sat in his desk drawer, sealed in regret. Now, standing in this glittering house that didn't smell like home, Walter realized how long it had been since he'd heard Michael laugh without calculation. The man sitting across from him tonight wore the same face as the boy he'd raised, but everything behind the eyes was different, colder, hungrier. Walter rubbed his thumb over the edge of the pocket watch. The metal was warm, steady, alive in a way that nothing else felt. He thought of Martha's words on her last day in the hospital. Promise me, Walt, you'll forgive him someday. Don't let grief turn you bitter. He'd nodded then, holding her frail hand, meaning it. But forgiveness was easy to promise when there was still time left to give it. Now that promise felt heavier than the watch in his pocket. The sound of faint laughter drifted from the dining room, snapping him back to the present. Vanessa's voice smooth as glass, Michael's measured, polite. Walter straightened his jacket and whispered to himself, You wanted peace, Martha, but maybe peace isn't what this is. He turned toward the door, the hallway lights glowing too bright, too clean. Somewhere deep inside, the past stirred, whispering in a voice that wasn't entirely his own. Sometimes the past doesn't fade, it waits. Walter returned to the dining room, his pulse steady but his mind racing. Michael and Vanessa looked up at once, their practiced smiles freezing just slightly before returning to place. Everything all right? Vanessa asked, her tone too light, her concern too polished. Fine, Walter said, lowering himself into the chair. Just needed some air. He reached for his napkin, pretending to adjust it, pretending not to see Michael's quick glance toward his untouched whiskey glass. The amber liquid shimmered under the chandelier, beautiful and poisonous. The phone in his pocket buzzed again. He didn't dare take it out in front of them, but his hand brushed against it beneath the tablecloth. He could feel the vibration still pulsing. When he finally dared a glance hidden behind the napkin, the new message glowed against the screen. The drink isn't safe. Don't sign anything tonight. Walter's chest tightened. He set the napkin down carefully, his eyes lifting to meet his son's. Michael was smiling too wide, too fast as he raised his own glass in a small toast. To family, Michael said. Walter hesitated for only a heartbeat before lifting his water glass instead. To honesty, he replied. The clink of glass on glass was soft, but it echoed like a gunshot in the silence that followed. For a few moments, conversation limped along, Vanessa asking about his health. Michael reminiscing about the old days. Walter nodded, half-listening eyes flicking to the corners of the room. Maria stood in the doorway again, refilling water glasses. When their eyes met, she blinked twice deliberately. A signal. Walter straightened his tie, masking the movement as he checked his pocket watch. It ticked softly, steady and alive. He imagined Martha's voice beside him. "Stay calm, Walt. Keep your eyes open." "So, Dad," Michael said, leaning forward, "have you thought about what comes next?" Walter looked up slowly. "Next? You've worked your whole life. Built something solid. You deserve to rest. Let someone else carry the load." Vanessa placed her manicured hand on Walter's arm. "He's right. You shouldn't worry about business at your age. We could help just until things settle." Walter forced a faint smile. "You mean until I'm gone?" Vanessa laughed softly, but her eyes didn't. "Oh, Mr. Reed, that's not what we meant. Of course not," Michael said quickly, waving his hand. "We just want to make sure everything's in order. Succession planning, estate security, simple stuff, that's all." Walter leaned back, letting his gaze drift toward the window. Outside, the reflection of the chandelier glimmered in the glass, 3 faces at a table, all pretending. "Estate security," Walter repeated quietly. "You've been thinking a lot about my estate lately, haven't you?" Michael chuckled nervously. "Come on, Dad. You always said business is about planning ahead." "Planning ahead," Walter murmured. "That's what this is." He lifted the whiskey glass, turning it slowly under the light. There, just at the bottom, tiny flecks shimmered like dust. Not ice, not sediment, something else. He set it down gently, never breaking eye contact with his son. "You know," he said evenly, "I stopped drinking hard liquor after your mother died." Michael's jaw twitched. Right, of course, forgot. But Vanessa was less careful. Her smile faltered for the first time. "You always liked scotch," she said, almost reproachful. Walter pretended not to hear her. "It's funny," he continued, "how habits change when you lose something that mattered." A silence spread like smoke. Maria appeared beside him again, clearing plates. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered the dishes. When she leaned closer, her voice was barely a whisper. "Don't drink," she breathed. "Please." Walter didn't turn his head. "Thank you," he murmured quietly, as if commenting on the meal. Michael was talking again, his voice loud now, as though volume could smooth tension. "Anyway, Dad, this isn't about now, just future planning. You still own all 7 garages, right? Yes. That's a lot to manage. If you ever got sick or worse, someone could take advantage. We just want to make sure the right person has authority." "The right person?" Walter repeated softly. "Meaning you." Michael smiled. "Meaning family." Vanessa nodded her fingers, tracing the rim of her glass. "Outsiders don't care the way family does." "Outsiders," Walter said slowly, glancing at Maria. "Sometimes notice things family overlooks." Neither of them caught the edge in his tone. Michael chuckled. "Dad, come on. You make it sound sinister. I make it sound real," Walter replied quietly. For a moment, Michael's confident mask slipped. The boy Walter remembered, the one who used to flinch when he lied, peeked through. Then it was gone, replaced by the polished salesman again. Vanessa rose gracefully. "I'll get dessert," she said. "You two catch up." As she disappeared into the kitchen, Michael's shoulders relaxed. "She worries too much," he said, leaning closer. "Listen, Dad, we're family. We should trust each other." "Trust," Walter said, letting the word roll off his tongue. "That's earned, not requested." Michael's smile stiffened. "That's exactly what this dinner's about. Earning it back." Before Walter could respond, his phone buzzed again in his pocket. He reached for his water glass to cover the movement, pretending to take a sip while sliding the screen into view under the tablecloth. "Watch their hands. Don't let them push papers tonight." He looked up, heartbeat pounding. Michael was reaching for his briefcase. Actually, his son said casually, "I brought something to show you. Nothing formal, just ideas." He set a stack of papers on the table, neatly bound the corner, marked by a gold notary seal. "Drafts," Michael said lightly. "You know, just preparing in case something ever happens. You taught me to think ahead." Walter looked at the papers. "What are they?" "Power of attorney. Property transfers. Just drafts." Michael repeated, his grin stretching too wide. "Look them over when you have time." Maria reappeared with dessert plates, setting them down carefully. She glanced once at the folder, then at Walter, her face pale. When she turned to leave, she brushed her hand lightly against his shoulder, a silent warning. Walter forced himself to stay calm. "We'll talk about them later," he said. "No need to rush." Michael nodded, but disappointment flickered across his face. "Sure, Dad. No rush." Walter excused himself once more, murmuring something about washing his hands. He stepped into the hallway, the sound of his own pulse roaring in his ears. Maria was waiting by the archway. Her voice trembled. "Mr. Reed, please, you must listen." Walter glanced back toward the dining room, then followed her into the kitchen. The air smelled of soap and lemon polish. Maria set down the tray and faced him. "They put something in your whiskey," she said, whispering fast. "I saw. They crushed something into it. I cleaned the glass after they tested it earlier." Walter's stomach turned. "You're certain?" She nodded quickly. "They said you'd sign papers tonight. I heard them talking. If you sign, they control everything." Walter steadied himself against the counter. "Why are you telling me this? Because you looked at me like a person," she said. "They don't." For a long moment, the kitchen was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. "What should I do?" Walter asked quietly. "Don't let them see you know. Pretend, delay. I will help." He looked at her, really looked. Fear lived in her eyes, but so did resolve. "Thank you," he whispered. "You're risking your job." She shook her head. "I'm risking more than that. But you must stay alive tonight." Walter inhaled slowly, forcing calm into his voice. "All right," he said to Maria. "I'll play along." "Good," she whispered. "I'll watch from the kitchen. If they bring the papers again, stall." Walter nodded once, then straightened his jacket. His reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator looked pale, but composed. "If Martha could see me now," he murmured, "then she'd tell you to fight smart." Maria replied softly. He gave her a faint smile and stepped back into the hallway. The sound of laughter floated from the dining room, too loud, too rehearsed. As he re-entered, both Michael and Vanessa turned toward him with bright, identical smiles. "There you are," Vanessa said sweetly. "We were just talking about vacations. You should join us on our next one." "Italy? Maybe. I've never been much for travel," Walter replied, taking a seat. Michael gestured to the papers again. "Dad, seriously, these are just drafts. Nothing binding. We can go over them together later this week, but if you want to look now—" Walter raised a hand. "Later," he said. "It's been a long day." "Of course," Vanessa said quickly, but her fingers drummed on the tablecloth, betraying her impatience. Walter studied her hands, steady, precise, like a woman used to getting her way. "You two seem nervous," he said. "Something wrong?" Michael laughed too high. "No, not at all. We're just excited. It's been years, you know. We finally have you here again." "Excited," Walter echoed. "That's one word for it." He glanced toward the kitchen doorway. Maria stood half-hidden, polishing an already spotless glass, eyes locked on him. He gave the slightest nod. So Walter said, breaking the silence, "Tell me about this real estate venture that bought you this place." Michael's smile faltered. "Oh, you know a little bit of everything. Investments. The market's good right now." "Must be," Walter said, sipping his water, "to afford something like this." "It's not all mine," Michael said quickly. "Partnerships, investors." Vanessa cut in too sharply. "It's all legitimate, Mr. Reed. You don't have to worry." Walter tilted his head. "Funny you'd say that. I wasn't worried until now." The air thickened. The chandelier hummed faintly overhead. Michael forced another laugh. "You've always been cautious, Dad. It's why you succeeded. But trust me, everything's fine." Walter leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "If you say so." A faint vibration against his thigh drew his attention. Another message. He hid the phone under the napkin, thumbed the screen. "Do not sign. Police notified." "Wait." His pulse quickened. He set the phone aside, careful not to reveal the tremor in his hand. Vanessa poured him more wine. "You barely touched your drink," she said. "It's good, aged, expensive." Walter smiled thinly. "Maybe later. My stomach's fragile these days." She hesitated, her smile fixed. "Of course." The next half hour stretched into an uneasy performance. Michael talked about expansion, about diversifying assets. Walter nodded, listening but not really hearing. He was counting seconds, watching every move. The pocket watch ticked in rhythm with his heartbeat. Then came the shift. Vanessa returned from the kitchen carrying a fresh tray of dessert creme brulee gleaming under the lights. Maria followed silently behind her, setting down clean spoons. For an instant, Maria's hand brushed Walter's arm, something small pressed into his palm. A flash drive, cold and metallic. She moved away before anyone could notice. Michael lifted his spoon. "You'll love this, Dad." Vanessa made it herself. Walter stared at the custard, its surface caramelized to perfection. He broke the crust with a soft crack and took a single bite, sweet, rich, almost bitter. "Delicious," he said. "I'm glad," Vanessa replied. "It's important we start fresh." "Fresh," Walter repeated. "That's one way to put it." Michael set down his spoon and reached for the papers again. "Dad, look, I know you don't like this stuff, but just read through the first page. It's basic names, signatures, nothing else." Walter dabbed his mouth with the napkin. "Not tonight." "Come on, Dad. It's just a formality. I said not tonight." His voice came out sharper than intended, and the silence that followed was razor thin. Vanessa's eyes darted to Michael's. Michael's jaw flexed. "You don't trust us," he said quietly. Walter met his gaze evenly. "Should I?" For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Michael's expression softened, replaced by something pitiful, almost desperate. "Dad, I just want to take care of you. You've done enough. Let me handle things." Walter's reply was steady. "You handle what you earn." The tension broke when the sound of sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Everyone froze. Vanessa blinked. Is that Michael's face drained of color? "Probably just a car accident," he muttered, but his fingers tapped the table faster now. The sirens grew louder. Walter kept his face calm, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You live in a safe neighborhood, right?" "No reason to worry." He looked down at the folder, then back at his son. "You were saying something about signatures?" Michael's mouth opened, then closed again. A sharp knock at the front door shattered the silence. Vanessa stood. "I'll get it." Michael shot to his feet. "No, wait!" But Maria was already there, moving quickly down the hallway. She opened the door. Blue and red lights washed through the foyer. "Evening," a deep voice said. "Lake Oswego Police Department. We received a call regarding a potential domestic emergency." Michael turned to Walter, his expression flickering between confusion and fear. "Dad, what did you do?" Walter didn't answer. He simply sat calm and composed while the officers stepped inside. Vanessa's voice cracked. "This is a mistake. There's no emergency here." One of the officers held up a tablet. "We received an anonymous tip with documentation attached. Alleged attempt of coercion and fraud. We'll need to ask a few questions." Walter rose slowly. His knees stiff but his spine straight. "You'll find what you need on that table," he said, nodding toward the papers. Michael's head snapped toward him. "You called them." "No," Walter said. "Someone who still believes in doing the right thing did." Maria stood in the background, silent, eyes lowered. Vanessa stepped forward, trembling now. "You can't just barge in." "This is private property, ma'am," the officer said firmly. "Please stay seated." Michael's mask finally cracked. "Dad, please. You don't understand. I had no choice." Walter looked at him for a long time. "You always had a choice. You just never liked the honest one." Another officer approached the table, lifting the folder carefully into an evidence bag. "Sir, we'll need you to come with us to make a statement." Walter nodded. "Of course." Vanessa collapsed into her chair, hands shaking. Michael's eyes filled with panic. "Dad, don't do this," he whispered. "They'll ruin me." Walter met his son's gaze one last time. "You ruined yourself." The officers escorted Michael out first. Vanessa followed silent, now her heels clicking on the marble like echoes of guilt. Maria lingered near the doorway. Walter turned to her, his voice low. "Thank you." She shook her head. "You saved yourself, Mr. Reed. I only gave you time." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes, that's all a man needs." The flashing lights painted the walls red and blue. Walter stood in their glow, alone but steady. He reached into his vest pocket, feeling the weight of Martha's watch ticking against his heart. He whispered, "It's over." Outside, the police cars pulled away, leaving the night still again. Walter exhaled long and slow. The house smelled of lilies and burnt sugar. He looked around one last time at the table set for three, at the untouched glass of whiskey, at the papers that had almost stolen his life. "He built an empire from grease and steel," he murmured, "and they tried to steal it with ink." Then he turned toward the door, stepping into the cool Oregon night, his silhouette framed by the fading lights of justice. He built an empire from grease and steel. Now his son wanted it signed away in ink. The drive back to Portland was silent, except for the hum of the old cab engine. Walter sat with his hands clasped, the night still flickering in his mind, the lights, the papers. Michael's voice breaking between fear and anger. By the time the cab reached his narrow street, the adrenaline had drained away, leaving only exhaustion and something heavier, grief. His house looked the same as always. The porch light burned weakly, the kitchen window glowed amber. Inside, everything smelled faintly of coffee and motor oil. He set his coat on the chair, placed Martha's pocket watch on the table beside his cooling cup, and sat without moving for a long time. The ticking filled the silence, steady, unforgiving. He whispered, "It's over," but the words didn't sound right. Nothing about it felt over. After a few minutes, he reached for the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Danner Law. A voice answered, calm and professional even at midnight. "Mr. Danner," Walter said. "It's Walter Reed. I need to speak with you." There was a pause, then a shift in tone. "Walter, it's been ages. What's happened?" Walter stared at the watch, the second hand spinning. "I was nearly tricked tonight by my own son." He told him everything, every detail from the dinner invitation to the police lights, his voice steady but drained. Danner listened without interrupting, the way he always had during business disputes years ago. When Walter finished, there was silence on the line. "Send me what you have." Danner said finally, "The USB. The papers, anything. I'll coordinate with the district attorney first thing in the morning." "You're safe now." "I think so," Walter replied. "For tonight. Then rest. We'll take it from here." When the call ended, Walter leaned back and stared at the ceiling. He felt old, older than 74, older than time. But beneath the fatigue was something cleaner, sharper, the certainty that he had done what Martha would have wanted. He stood and walked to the living room window. Outside, dawn was beginning to thin the darkness. The street was empty except for the faint glow of street lamps and the quiet rustle of wind through the trees. On the mantel sat their wedding photo, Martha in her simple ivory dress, smiling at him like he was her whole world. He touched the frame lightly. "You told me to forgive him someday," he murmured, "but you never said how." He poured himself a cup of coffee, black and bitter, and sat again. Forgiveness had always seemed like an endpoint, something clean and absolute. Now it felt more like an act of survival, choosing not to drown in resentment. He turned the pocket watch over in his palm, tracing the engraving on the back. "To my Walt, who never gives up." The irony almost made him smile. By the time the first rays of sunlight touched the window, the phone rang again. The display showed a name he almost didn't want to see. Michael. Walter stared at it until the ringing stopped, but it started again, insistent. With a sigh, he picked it up. "Dad." Michael's voice cracked on the first word. "Thank God you answered. Listen, last night it got out of hand. I didn't mean for things to go that far." Walter's tone was cold. "Far enough to poison me?" Silence. Then Michael's voice smaller. "I panicked. Vanessa said it was just to calm you so you'd sign. I didn't know." "You didn't know," Walter interrupted. "You're 38 years old, Michael. You knew exactly what you were doing. I swear, Dad, I wasn't trying to hurt you. I just needed to fix things. I owe money in these people." He stopped abruptly, realizing he'd said too much. Walter leaned forward. "What people?" "You don't understand," Michael said quickly. "They don't wait for payment. They don't care about police or lawyers. If I don't deliver soon, they'll... What Michael hesitated, then whispered, "They'll come for me. Or you." Walter's hand tightened on the receiver. "So that's what this was. You thought you could solve your problems by taking mine." "It wasn't like that," Michael shouted, then dropped his voice. "Dad, please. I made mistakes, but you're my father. Help me, just this once." Walter stared out the window, watching sunlight creep over the neighbor's fence. For the first time in hours, he didn't feel fear or anger, just an ache deep enough to be calm. "I did help you," he said quietly. "I gave you a life built on hard work and honesty. I gave you everything that mattered. You threw it away." Michael's breath hitched. "You're going to the police, aren't you?" "They already have everything they need," Walter said. "The papers, the emails, your words." "You can't do this," Michael whispered. "They'll destroy me." "No," Walter said softly. "You already did that." He ended the call. For a long moment he sat there, the phone still in his hand. The room felt lighter, somehow emptied of tension, but filled with something else, truth. He looked again at Martha's picture. "You wanted forgiveness," he said. "I'll find it. But not today." He stood carrying the watch to the window. The morning was bright now. Across the street, the neighbor's kid was fixing a bike, the chain slipping through his fingers. Walter smiled faintly. "Grease and steel," he murmured. "The world still turns." He returned to the table, opened a small notebook, and began writing details, times, names. Everything Danner and the police would need. He wasn't done fighting yet. When he finished, he closed the notebook, exhaled, and leaned back in his chair. The pocket watch ticked softly beside his coffee cup, steady as ever. "Forgiveness isn't surrender," he said aloud. "It's clarity." He reached for the phone again, dialing Danner once more. "It's Walter. Tell the DA I'll come in this afternoon. They should hear it straight from me." Then he hung up and looked around his kitchen, the walls still scarred with memories, the air thick with peace and regret. He smiled faintly. "Would you protect your legacy?" he murmured, "even from your own blood?" The watch ticked once more, as if answering him. 3 days later, Walter woke to the sound of his phone buzzing against the nightstand. The sun had barely risen, and the light through his blinds painted long gray stripes across the wall. He reached for the phone, squinting at the screen. A headline glared back at him. "Local entrepreneur under investigation for forgery and attempted fraud." Beneath it, a photo of Michael, his once confident smile replaced by something hollow and dazed. Walter exhaled, setting the phone down beside Martha's pocket watch. The world outside was quiet, still waking up, but inside his chest everything felt strangely still. Not peace, something heavier, quieter, like the moment after a storm when you can still smell the rain. The phone rang again. This time it was Danner. "You've seen the news?" the lawyer asked. "I have." The DA's office moved fast. They traced the forged drafts to a notary Michael used under a false name. "Between that and the USB drive you handed over, the case is solid." Walter nodded slowly. "Good. There'll be a preliminary hearing tomorrow. You'll need to testify briefly. Just a statement to establish the facts." "I'll be there." Danner hesitated. "There's one more thing. Someone leaked documents to the press. Anonymous source, but it matches the evidence packet Maria gave you." Walter smiled faintly. "Then she did what she had to. You're not upset?" "No," he said softly. "Sometimes truth needs a louder voice." When he hung up, he poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, staring out the window at the city waking below. The morning air carried a chill, but he felt warm inside, steady, grounded. He thought of Martha again, her calm voice, her faith that the world would always bend back toward justice. "She was right," he murmured. The next morning, the courthouse stood cold and gray against the cloudy sky. Walter arrived early, his coat buttoned tight. Martha's watch ticking beneath the fabric. Reporters crowded the steps, their microphones flashing, but he moved through them silently. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper. Rows of benches stretched beneath high windows. When he entered, heads turned, not out of recognition but curiosity. The old man from the papers, the one whose son had betrayed him. At the defense table, Michael sat slumped in a dark suit, his hair unkempt, his eyes rimmed red. Vanessa sat beside him, immaculate as ever, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at her husband. Walter took his seat behind the prosecution's table. Danner gave him a reassuring nod. The judge entered, silver-haired, firm. "Court is now in session," she said, her voice echoing off marble. The district attorney began by summarizing the case. Michael Reed is charged with attempted fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud his father, Walter Reed, of property and assets valued in excess of $2 million. The words hung heavy in the air. Walter glanced at his son, who refused to meet his gaze. The prosecution presented the documents, the fake drafts, the email exchanges between Michael and Vanessa. Then came the recordings from Walter's phone, snippets of conversation, Michael's voice cracking under guilt. Michael's lawyer objected, argued, but the evidence mounted too high to climb over. Then the bailiff called the next witness, Maria Alvarez. Maria stepped forward, clutching her small purse in both hands. Her posture was straight, but her fingers trembled. When she was sworn in, her voice wavered only slightly. "I worked for Mr. and Mrs. Reed for 2 years," she said. "I cleaned, I served meals, but I also heard things I wish I hadn't. The courtroom leaned in. She told them everything, how Vanessa ordered sedatives from a contact under a false name, how Michael rehearsed what to say when his father arrived, how they tested the drug in a glass days before the dinner. Her accent thickened with emotion, but her words were clear. They thought I didn't understand English, she said softly, but I did. I heard when they said, once he signs it's done. That's when I knew I couldn't stay quiet. Michael's lawyer rose sharply. Miss Alvarez, are you sure you're not exaggerating? You were fired shortly after, weren't you? Maria met his eyes steady now. No, I quit. Because I couldn't work for people planning to destroy their own family. A murmur rippled through the room. The judge called for order. Walter felt something tighten in his throat. Pride, sorrow, gratitude all tangled together. When the DA finished questioning her, Maria turned her head slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. Walter nodded once. She nodded back. Then unexpectedly Vanessa stood. Your Honor. She said, her tone sharp. I wish to make a statement. Her lawyer whispered urgently, but she brushed him off. I have evidence that proves Michael orchestrated this. Bank records, wire transfers, emails. I was manipulated. Michael shot to his feet. Liar, he shouted. You were in on it from the start. The gavel struck hard. Mr. Reed, sit down, the judge ordered. But Michael kept shouting, voice cracking under rage. She planned it. She wanted the money more than I did. Vanessa didn't look at him. She handed a small folder to the prosecutor. Everything you need is in there. The judge sighed. Very well, we'll review this submission. Michael sank back into his seat, shaking his head, muttering to himself. For the first time, he looked small, like the boy Walter remembered, lost and furious at a world that refused to bend. After the testimonies, the judge turned toward Walter. Mr. Reed, you may address the court if you wish. Walter rose slowly, gripping the edge of the table for balance. His knees ached, but his voice did not. I didn't come here for revenge, he said. I came because truth deserves to stand. A man doesn't measure his strength by what he gains, but by what he refuses to lose: his name, his honor, his decency. My son forgot that. I almost did too. The courtroom fell silent. Even Michael stopped moving. Walter continued, quieter now. This isn't victory, it's survival, and maybe someday it will be forgiveness. But not today. He sat down. The judge nodded once, her expression unreadable. The jury filed out. 38 minutes later, they returned. On all counts, the foreman said, we find the defendant Michael Reed guilty. Michael closed his eyes. Vanessa stared straight ahead. Walter exhaled long and slow. When the judge adjourned, the room erupted in whispers. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered names, but Walter heard none of it. He stood, adjusted his coat, and glanced once more at his son. Michael was speaking to his lawyer. His face pale, his future collapsing. Walter turned away. Outside the courthouse, cold wind swept across the steps. Reporters surged forward, calling his name, but he kept walking. The ticking in his pocket was the only sound he needed. Justice wasn't triumph. It was weight finally lifted. He whispered to the sky, you were right, Martha. Families always find their way back, just not always the way we expect. When the verdict was done and the cameras had vanished, Walter walked down the courthouse steps alone. The winter wind tugged at his coat, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust. Martha's pocket watch ticked steadily in his palm every second, a reminder that time moved forward whether you were ready or not. Michael was sentenced. Vanessa cooperated, striking her deal. Justice had come, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like silence, heavy, clean, and unchangeable. That evening, Walter returned to his small house in Portland. The porch light flickered once before holding steady. He hung his coat by the door, set the watch on the table, and sat in the chair he'd sat in for years. The house hummed with the faint buzz of the refrigerator, the world quiet around him. 3 days later, a gentle knock came at the door. When he opened it, Maria stood there with a tin of cookies in her hands. I baked, she said shyly. He smiled. You didn't have to. I wanted to, she said. You reminded me that honesty still matters. He invited her in. They shared coffee at the kitchen table. She looked around the small room, photos, tools, Martha's recipe cards. She'd be proud of you, Maria said softly. Walter nodded, eyes damp. Maybe, I hope so. When she left, the house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. A week later, an envelope arrived postmarked from the county jail. The handwriting stopped him cold. Michael. He opened it slowly. Dad, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve to be called your son. But sitting here stripped of everything, I finally see what mattered. If there's anything left of me worth saving, it's because of you. Michael. Walter read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it between the pages of Martha's Bible beside the pressed flowers she once kept there. That afternoon, he drove to the cemetery. The air was cold, the sky a quiet gray. He brushed the leaves from Martha's headstone and placed the pocket watch beside it. I thought revenge would feel loud, he said softly. But it feels like this quiet, steady, like breathing again. Back home, as he closed the garage for the night, his eyes caught something on the workbench, a small toy car, its paint-chipped wheels rusted. Michael's from decades ago. He picked it up, turned it in his hand and smiled. Some things you don't erase, he whispered. You just leave them where they belong. The pocket watch ticked once warm against the still air. Voices fade, but guilt echoes louder. If you felt something tonight, let me know in the comments. Sometimes just knowing we're not alone makes all the difference. Subscribe if you want to walk through more stories like this, stories that remember, forgive, and endure. Thank you for watching.